now, here we are, 2025. We see many, many people expatriating. The numbers have basically skyrocketed.
A lot.
Yes.
Thousands of Americans are planning to pack their bags and move abroad. Google search data shows U.S. citizens are actively researching how to move to Canada, New Zealand, and Australia.
When I moved overseas, I thought I was starting new country, new chapter, total freedom. But what I didn't realize is that even after you leave the US, you still have to file and pay US taxes. And the system is a lot more complicated than I've ever expected. That's exactly why I flew to Dubai to sit down with Virginia La Torre Jeker, one of the top experts in US international tax law. She's been doing this for over 40 years and has seen how easily Americans abroad get caught off guard, and more importantly, what you can do to stay ahead of it.
So could you share a little bit with me about yourself and what drew you into all of this in the first place?
Sure. Okay, so I was a young attorney a long time ago in New York City, and I met my husband, who is a Swiss national, and he was not enamored with America. So when we decided to marry, which was literally 6 weeks after we met, I knew that I wouldn't be living in the States. And I had been looking around with headhunters as to where could we both go. I was a U.S. tax attorney. My husband was a Swiss banker, and they suggested looking in Asia, particularly Hong Kong. So I moved to Hong Kong. My husband got his job. I got my job at a very big New York firm that had a branch out there in Hong Kong, and started working abroad. That was 1986, so very long time ago. The field of U.S. international tax, dealing with expatriates, dealing with foreigners that have American investments or family members, and they're wondering how to structure their estates because U.S. tax really is so long-reaching and far-reaching. We had many, many issues with international tax coming up, and I had to learn all of that because as a New York-based attorney, you were only seeing domestic issues, really, U.S. issues,
Right.
not issues pertaining to foreigners. So that was what started me on that journey way back in 1986. And here it is, almost 40 years later, moving from Hong Kong to the Middle East. We've just encountered so many different kinds of tax matters for people. And as you probably are aware, the tax world has changed dramatically since 2007, when we had the UBS scandal with Americans having overseas bank accounts. I think that was the watershed that really started a focus on expatriates living abroad, having overseas assets. And then soon after that, debacle with Bradley Birkenfeld, we had Obama enacting FATCA, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, which, was well-intentioned, but its repercussions for Americans abroad,
Unfortunately.
were very, very huge. And so I've seen so many changes. I've seen, in 1993, I did my first expatriation for a U.S. citizen who was giving up U.S. citizenship. And I thought, my goodness, how could anyone ever do that? How bizarre is that? And the tax issues are very complex when someone expatriates. And now, here we are, 2025. We see many, many people expatriating. The numbers have basically skyrocketed.
A lot.
Yes. And I think with the Trump administration, we're going to see more. People are looking for an exit. So yes, I've been around quite some time in this international tax world, and it's been a fascinating journey.
So a lot of Americans, they imagine moving abroad like this. Beautiful experience. They think of the adventure, kind of like the new culture, new lifestyle. It's really exciting at first. But from your experience, what is the biggest misconception about U.S. tax rules that still follow them overseas?
Oh, there's quite a few, but I would say a huge misconception is the following. People have a lot of information available to them online. And especially now, we have ChatGPT, we have Grok, you name it, we can plug it in and get an answer. So a little bit of knowledge is a very dangerous thing.
Yeah.
And when it comes to US tax, the issues, they can be fairly simple in an international level, but they usually are not, and they're usually very complex. So people have to be careful when they think they have, oh, I have all this information, I know what to do.
I read it online.
I read a Google post, whatever. That is the biggest danger. And I think people need to be aware that while there is a lot of information online that's available, some of it is wrong. Most of it is not dealing with the nuances that are required for a particular situation. They're giving you, the broad brush. And where the professional advice comes in is dealing with those nuances. So you may have someone who says, look, I know I'm working overseas. I get the foreign earned income exclusion. I get to exclude $130,000 of my income. That's fantastic. They're not paying attention. What is earned income?
Right.
It is income you earn from your salary, your services being performed overseas. There are a few nuanced tests to be met, but let's just take that broad category of foreign earned income. What does it mean? It's not something like dividends you earn from a foreign company. It's not rental income you may earn from renting your overseas apartment. So people have to be very careful because we see people saying, well, I got the 130, and they're including things that shouldn't be included. And then it becomes even more complicated if they're working for a foreign employer and they are having a pension plan, for example. So the employer is putting contributions into that foreign pension plan. The typical expat is not thinking that that amount has to be included in their tax return.
Okay.
Because, the employer puts it in. It's my pension plan. I don't get it until whatever I'm 65 or whatever the deal is. Unfortunately, these things don't work when it's a foreign pension plan. Okay, the rules require certain requirements to be met for employer contributions to a plan. It has to be a qualified plan. The foreign plans aren't. They're designed to meet foreign law, not US tax law. So we have issues like this that, as I say, become very nuanced, and people, I think they're not, if you're a layman, you're an excited expat living overseas, you're not thinking of that nitty-gritty.
Not at all.
Not at all.
No.
And there's so many bits of nitty-gritty that we see that can just fall in between the cracks. I mean, a simple thing, the employer is going to pay your child's schooling abroad. They're going to pay for domestic help for you. They're going to give you airline tickets to go back home once or twice a year. These items are actually part of your taxable income.
Really?
Yes, people don't think of that.
Right.
And so there's a lot that needs to be thought through, and I just don't see it. I just don't see it happening. You need years of experience, really, to get those nuanced bits and understand them, to be able to give holistic advice to someone.
So on that note, you've worked with, countless expats who've only found out about these rules after they've already settled abroad. So could you share a story that really shows just how stressful and overwhelming it can be if you are caught off guard with all of this?
Oh, being caught off guard, many people are. People shouldn't panic if that happens to them. I know it's an overwhelming feeling, and of course, the first response is to panic. But if you can get the proper tax help, it can usually be sorted. I'll give you an example of someone that had an overwhelming situation. So we have the case of a young gentleman who moved from the US and began working overseas. And his employer was an American employer. Mm-hmm. And the American employer was withholding income tax, because that's what they do. Even though you work overseas, you're still withhold. Your income tax will be withheld. And the employer gave them the opportunity to work with one of the big four firms that the employer would pay for having the taxes handled for them. So this person was overjoyed, and his salary was being withheld upon from the taxes, and he was working with one of the big fours to prepare his tax returns. In his mind, he thought, I've sent all of my information to the Big Four. My employer's been withholding, so my tax issues are sorted, right? Wrong, because he didn't realize you have to actually review your tax returns as prepared by the Big Four. You need to sign them. You need to get them sent into the IRS. He was so absorbed in his job that he let all of these things go. And what happened was the IRS prepared something called a substitute for return, an SFR. A substitute for return is a very dangerous thing. So the IRS was getting the W-2s from the employer saying, you know, we've withheld tax on this gentleman and all of his tax ID information. But the IRS never got a tax return from him. So they prepared their own tax return for him.
Oh my God.
This is a substitute for return. And they don't take into account the fact that the person's working abroad. He's entitled to the foreign earned income exclusion. He's entitled to the foreign housing exclusion, maybe. You know, he's got sales of securities and stocks. He's had losses. They don't take any of that into account with an SFR. They only take into account the available information, which was the W-2s. What ended up happening, he didn't know the IRS was on to him with these issues because he didn't advise the IRS of a change of address. There's a special way to do that. So they levied on, he had assets in America. They levied on those assets, and he's in collection now with the IRS. And was notified somehow of these levies that they were going to, take his bank account and so forth, and came in a huge panic and had actually gotten some advice, which was, to my mind, not the best advice at all. And we have, helped this person sort out that mess and reach tax compliance without penalties.
Beautiful.
Yes, but to get to that point, it requires an awful lot of digging and getting all the facts and preparing the proper explanations for the IRS as to how this could happen, and using whatever resources you have available. Like, you really need to think through as an advisor, what can help my client? The client's a dual national. That's very helpful. How long did he live in the States? Maybe he's really been living most of his life abroad and won't have the understanding that someone who's been living and working in America would have about the tax system. The professionals should really be digging and getting that to the deep-rooted issues and helping the client use those to abate penalties with the IRS. With many tax advisors and tax return preparers, you don't see that thoroughness, which is unfortunate. But I think that, again, so much of it is because we use ChatGPT, we use Grok. I'm from the old school where
We didn't have none of that.
we didn't have any of it, and we had to really plow through, and that's held us all in good stead, people from my generation, because we've learned there are no shortcuts when it comes to this.
No, definitely not. So if someone is, overseas and realize that they have overlooked, these tax requirements, maybe they're years behind on paperwork, what is the best first step that they can take to kind of get back on track and avoid total panic?
I think avoiding total panic is difficult, but very important. I think the best first step is to find a very good tax advisor who can guide them. Easier said than done. There's tons of people out there online. The individual has to really do a lot of questioning to see how much experience that professional has with a case such as his or hers. So, for example, the IRS has various programs where people can, if they have made mistakes, didn't know what they should have been filing and so forth, they have the streamlined program that can help them, depending if they're living abroad or even if they're stateside but had foreign accounts and assets that were not properly reported. These programs can help them. Sometimes the streamlined program is not the best option. You have to really find out the individual's facts. So I gave you an example before about the individual who was already in collection and had the IRS levies on his U.S. assets. That individual cannot join a streamlined program because the IRS has already discovered his situation. And once the IRS discovers that you have not been tax compliant and initiates discussion with you about this, you cannot join a streamlined program. So what might be best for you is to say, all right, let me get all of the facts together that can possibly help this person compile what's called a reasonable cause statement. Reasonable cause can possibly eliminate, if not reduce, IRS penalties for tax noncompliance. Has to be very carefully drafted. People will come and say, oh, well, I didn't know. So I have reasonable cause, right? I've been living abroad. Why should I know about what I should file? Why? Because there's so much online. The IRS website is replete with information for Americans abroad and what their duties are to meet the tax obligations. So you need more than I didn't know. You really need a solid explanation as to why you didn't know.
Right.
Okay. What is your rationale? Did you have stuff going on in your life? We've had people that have had serious health issues, loved ones passing away and so forth. And that's the reason they missed out on a couple of years' filings. So you really have to dig and see what is the best thing for this particular individual to use in order to try and abate IRS penalties. There's no one size fits all. I think that's a problem with too many advisors. They get latched into this idea that streamlined will work or their client has reasonable cause, when in fact those might not be the appropriate vehicles for that particular individual.
So if you could say just one thing to Americans who are thinking about moving abroad, but they're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, a little bit anxious, what would you want them to hear?
I think what can really help with anxiety and help them remain on the right track with their tax obligations is to find a source of information that's reliable and that really covers a lot of ground for the American expat. The IRS website is very good, but it might be overwhelming because there's so much on it.
Okay.
My U.S. tax blog, which has been going for many, many years, has separate categories. Americans overseas. I have a primer for people that are moving abroad. What are the main issues that they need to be concerned with? So I think people should familiarize themselves first by doing some research on their own. And then they can start looking for a good tax advisor. Now, someone may have a very simple situation where they're just working for an employer abroad. It could be a foreign employer. It could be an American employer. It doesn't matter, what that is. If it's an American employer, they're going to be having withholding on their salary. If it's a foreign employer, they won't be withholding. So then they have to worry about estimated taxes being made. But the person can learn some of the basics, and then with that knowledge, they can be looking for the advisor and asking questions and seeing, does this person really know what he or she is talking about? Are they the right fit for me? And if they're not sure, it's probably a very wise idea to use someone with a lot of experience to initially get the views and say, what should I be looking for? I've got a foreign pension plan. What should I be looking for if I get a tax return preparer? Form 8938, people will be able to advise them if they use someone with a lot of knowledge to at least get the blueprint for what's needed. They don't have to use that expensive person to do everything, but at least get the blueprint and say, okay, now I have found my tax advisor who's given me the blueprint. I will now find the tax return preparer who I think can meet these standards. I think that's a really good way to approach it. They should check my U.S. tax blog so people can read up. As I say, I have categories. I have the tax primer. And I had a lovely experience. Someone who's now a wealth advisor for quite a few years, he said to me, Virginia, I've been following your blog since I was in law school. And I still follow it. So I liked hearing that.
Beautiful. Thank you.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.